The midwife's hands trembled as she pulled back the blood-stained sheet, revealing something that defied every law of nature she knew. In the dim lamplight of a 19th-century German farmhouse, what should have been a moment of joy became a medical impossibility that would haunt 3 generations. This is the story of how one family's darkest secret created the most genetically compromised child ever documented in medical history. The year was 1847, and in the remote village of Kleinworth, nestled between rolling hills and dense black forest pine, the sound of birthing cries echoed through timber walls. The scent of burning sage mixed with copper and fear hung thick in the air, while rough-hewn floorboards creaked under the weight of 3 women who had delivered dozens of healthy babies. But nothing had prepared them for this. Anna Weiss had been pregnant for exactly 9 months, yet no one in the village could identify the father, not because she was promiscuous or secretive, but because the truth was far more disturbing than anyone dared imagine. The 22-year-old woman had never left her family's isolated farm, never courted a suitor, never even spoken to men outside her immediate family circle. Medical records from the Kleinworth parish, discovered in 1993, reveal the midwife's frantic notes: child born with severe deformities, breathing labored. Parents refused to explain conception. God help us all. The baby girl, named Gretchen, weighed barely 4 pounds and exhibited physical abnormalities that the village doctor had never encountered. Her skull was malformed, her limbs shortened and twisted, and her internal organs showed signs of severe developmental issues. But the most disturbing discovery came weeks later, when a traveling physician examined the child and made a connection that would scandalize the medical community for decades. Through careful genealogical research and primitive blood analysis available at the time, Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann uncovered the truth that the Weiss family had desperately tried to conceal. Anna's pregnancy wasn't the result of romance or even assault by a stranger. The father was someone much closer to home. What would you do if you discovered that everyone in your community had been willfully blind to the truth? The Weiss family had been practicing systematic inbreeding for 3 generations, believing it would preserve their bloodline and keep their modest wealth within the family. Anna's parents, Johann and Margarete, were themselves first cousins. Anna's grandparents shared the same great-grandfather. And most shocking of all, baby Gretchen's father was Anna's own brother Heinrich, who had been quietly continuing the family tradition with his sister's full consent. But this was only the beginning. As Dr. Zimmermann dug deeper into the family's history, he realized that Gretchen represented the culmination of decades of genetic concentration that had created what he termed a perfect storm of hereditary defects. The child wasn't just inbred. She was the product of the most systematically concentrated gene pool he had ever encountered. The villagers had suspected something was amiss with the Weiss family for years. Children playing near their property reported strange sounds at night. Neighbors noticed that family members rarely appeared in public together, and the local priest had documented his concerns about the family's refusal to participate in community marriage arrangements. Yet everyone chose to look the other way, perhaps sensing that some truths are too dark to confront. Sometimes silence is complicity. As winter approached Kleinworth in 1847, baby Gretchen's condition continued to deteriorate. But her tragic birth was merely the visible symptom of a much larger horror that had been growing in the shadows for generations. The medical records Dr. Zimmermann was compiling would soon reveal that the Weiss family's practices had created not just one damaged child, but an entire lineage of genetic devastation that stretched back further than anyone had imagined. What no one in Kleinworth understood yet was that Gretchen's birth would expose a network of similar families throughout the region, all connected by blood and bound by the same terrible secret. The most inbred child ever born was about to reveal the existence of an entire community built on genetic isolation so extreme that it challenged the very definition of humanity. Before we dive deeper into this medical nightmare, Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you're ready to uncover the full truth about Europe's most isolated genetic community, hit that like button and subscribe, because what we're about to reveal will change how you think about family secrets forever. But first, we need to understand how 3 generations of the Weiss family had managed to hide their practices from the outside world, and what drove them to continue breeding within their bloodline, even as the consequences became increasingly horrific. Dr. Zimmermann's hand shook as he traced the genealogical chart spread across his desk, each line revealing a pattern more disturbing than the last. What he had initially assumed was a single case of unfortunate inbreeding was actually the deliberate result of a 70-year breeding program that defied medical comprehension. The systematic destruction of genetic diversity within the Weiss bloodline represented the most extreme case of intentional inbreeding ever documented in European medical history. The doctor's investigation had begun with a simple question: how could a family living in such isolation produce a child with genetic defects so severe that they seemed almost engineered? The answer lay in a leather-bound family ledger he discovered, hidden beneath the floorboards of the Weiss farmhouse, written in Johann Weiss's meticulous handwriting. The entries, dating back to 1776, revealed the chilling methodology behind their genetic isolation. Year 1782. Read one entry: "My daughter Bertha has reached marriageable age. To preserve the purity of our bloodline and ensure our wealth remains within the family, she shall wed her cousin Wilhelm. Their children will be raised to understand the sacred duty of blood preservation." The Weiss family hadn't stumbled into inbreeding through circumstance or isolation. They had planned it. Johann's grandfather, Friedrich Weiss, had emigrated from Bavaria with a substantial inheritance and a paranoid obsession with maintaining what he called blood purity. Friedrich believed that mixing with outside families would dilute both their genetic superiority and their accumulated wealth. By the time Anna gave birth to Gretchen in 1847, the family tree had become a tangled web of genetic repetition. Dr. Zimmermann's calculations revealed that Anna and her brother Heinrich shared approximately 68% of their genetic material, a level of similarity typically found only between parent and child. Parish records from neighboring villages tell a different story than the one the Weiss family constructed. Father Klaus Müller, from the adjacent town of Bergheim, had documented his concerns about the family as early as 1823, writing, "The Weiss household presents disturbing signs of unnatural family relations. Their children appear sickly and withdrawn, and the family refuses all offers of suitable marriage arrangements with healthy bloodlines from our community." But the most damning evidence came from Dr. Zimmermann's examination of Gretchen's older siblings, all of whom had died in infancy or early childhood. The family cemetery behind their farmhouse contained 17 small graves, each marking another failed attempt to continue their bloodline. Medical records suggested that most had died from complications directly related to severe genetic defects: heart malformations, kidney failure, seizure disorders, and developmental abnormalities that made survival impossible. How many warning signs can a community ignore before they become complicit in the horror? The ledger revealed that Johann and Margarete had been expecting these deaths, even planning for them. "We must continue until we produce a child strong enough to survive and carry forward our pure blood," Johann had written after the death of their 14th child. God tests our devotion through these trials. Some traditions should die. What Dr. Zimmermann found most disturbing wasn't just the systematic nature of the inbreeding, but the family's detailed documentation of their genetic experiments. They had been tracking traits across generations, attempting to concentrate what they perceived as desirable characteristics, while seemingly oblivious to the devastating health consequences. The ledger contained crude diagrams showing attempted genetic predictions, mapping eye color, hair texture, and even personality traits they hoped to preserve. The family had essentially turned themselves into a laboratory, with each pregnancy serving as another data point in their misguided quest for genetic perfection. Anna's pregnancy with Gretchen represented the culmination of this multi-generational experiment, and finally, a child who survived long enough for the outside world to witness the results. But as Dr. Zimmermann would soon discover, the Weiss family wasn't working in isolation. Hidden within their correspondence were letters from other families throughout the German countryside, all sharing strategies for maintaining bloodline purity and comparing results of their own inbreeding programs. Gretchen's birth had exposed not just one family's dark secret, but an entire underground network of genetic experimentation that stretched across Central Europe, and the most disturbing discoveries were yet to come. The letter arrived at Dr. Zimmermann's clinic on a gray October morning, sealed with black wax and bearing no return address. Inside, written in careful Gothic script, was an invitation that would expose the true scope of what he had uncovered. Esteemed doctor, your inquiries regarding the Weiss family have reached interested parties. We cordially invite you to witness the fruits of our collective labors. What Dr. Zimmermann thought was an isolated case of familial madness was actually part of a coordinated movement that had been operating in secret for nearly a century. The invitation led him to a remote monastery outside Dresden, where on November 15, 1847, he encountered something that challenged every assumption about the limits of human genetic manipulation. The sound of labored breathing echoed through stone corridors. The antiseptic smell of carbolic acid couldn't mask an underlying odor of decay, and the cold granite floors seemed to absorb the whispered prayers of attendants caring for dozens of severely deformed children. Brother Augustus, the monastery's record keeper, led Dr. Zimmermann through what could only be described as a living museum of genetic horrors. Each room contained children representing different families' attempts at bloodline concentration, all bearing the unmistakable signs of extreme inbreeding. But unlike the isolated tragedy of baby Gretchen, these children were part of a systematic study. We have been documenting the sacred science of blood purity for 83 years, Brother Augustus explained, his voice carrying the conviction of absolute faith. What you witnessed with the Weiss child represents merely one branch of our greater work. The monastery's hidden archives contain genealogical charts more complex than anything Dr. Zimmermann had seen in medical school. Families across the German states had been corresponding for generations, sharing detailed breeding records and genetic observations. The Hoffmann family from Saxony, the Brenner clan from Bavaria, the Eisenberg household from Prussia, all had been participating in what they called the Great Preservation. Documents from 1831 reveal the chilling scope of their coordination. A letter from Wilhelm Hoffmann to Johann Weiss reads, "Our latest offspring survived 7 months before succumbing to the breathing sickness. However, we observed improved bone density compared to previous generations. We recommend continuing the brother-sister pairings for at least 2 more cycles to achieve optimal concentration." These weren't ignorant farmers stumbling into genetic catastrophe. They were conducting organized experiments on their own children, keeping meticulous records of birth defects, survival rates, and what they perceived as successful trait preservation. They had created an entire pseudo-scientific framework to justify their actions, complete with terminology that made their practices sound like legitimate research. What would you do if you discovered that an entire community had convinced itself that child suffering was a necessary sacrifice for genetic progress? Dr. Zimmermann's examination of the monastery's residents revealed the mathematical horror of their success. The average coefficient of inbreeding among these children was 0.375, meaning that nearly 40% of their genetic material was identical. For comparison, the children of first cousins typically share only 12.5%. These children represented the most genetically concentrated humans ever recorded. The medical consequences were staggering. Not one child could walk normally. Cognitive development ranged from severely delayed to completely absent. Most suffered from multiple organ defects, skeletal deformities, and neurological conditions that caused constant pain. Yet their families continued to view them not as victims, but as necessary steps toward achieving what they called ultimate genetic purity. Brother Augustus showed Dr. Zimmermann a chart tracking the progression of traits across generations. "Observe how the eye color has become increasingly consistent," he said, pointing to a lineage where blue eyes appeared in 97% of births. "We are approaching perfection in this characteristic." The fact that those same children were blind seemed irrelevant to their calculations. Bloodline obsession had become bloodline destruction. But the most disturbing revelation came when Dr. Zimmermann examined the monastery's correspondence from other European countries. The German families weren't working alone. Similar programs were operating in remote areas of Austria, Switzerland, and even France. Letters described breeding partnerships between families separated by hundreds of miles, all working toward the same goal of genetic concentration. One letter from a French correspondent, dated October 3, 1846, described shipping arrangements for what he euphemistically called breeding stock. Young family members sent to other participating households to continue the genetic experimentation. These children were being traded like livestock, their only value measured in how closely they were related to their intended partners. The network had even developed a ranking system for genetic purity, with families competing to achieve the highest levels of inbreeding while keeping their children alive long enough to reproduce. Baby Gretchen's survival past 3 months had earned the Weiss family considerable prestige within this underground community. As winter darkness settled over the monastery, Dr. Zimmermann realized that exposing this network would require more than medical documentation. He was confronting a belief system so deeply entrenched that its practitioners viewed the suffering of their own children as a sacred duty, and they were preparing to expand their operations beyond anything he had yet imagined. The journal Dr. Ander Zimmermann discovered in Brother Augustus's private chambers contained entries that made his stomach turn, each page revealing how religious fervor had been weaponized to justify genetic experimentation. The leather-bound book, titled Divine Genealogy, God's Plan for Perfect Bloodlines, had been circulating among the families for decades, serving as both instruction manual and moral justification for their practices. The underground network had transformed child abuse into a religious mission, complete with theological arguments that portrayed genetic concentration as God's intended path for human evolution. Brother Augustus opened the journal to a page marked with dried flowers, his weathered fingers tracing text that had been copied and recopied by dozens of hands. The passage, originally written by the network's founder, a defrocked priest named Father Heinrich Müller, read, "As God concentrated his divine essence into Christ, so must we concentrate our earthly essence to approach his perfection. The suffering of our children purifies their souls while perfecting their forms." The monastery's walls echoed with the sounds of morning prayers, but the scent of medicinal herbs couldn't mask the underlying odor of infected wounds, and the rough stone floors were stained with decades of bodily fluids from children too damaged to control their functions. This wasn't a hospital, it was a shrine to genetic obsession disguised as holy work. Dr. Zimmermann learned that the network had developed an entire theology around inbreeding, complete with cherry-picked biblical passages that supposedly supported their practices. They cited the marriage of Abraham and Sarah, who were half-siblings, and the isolated bloodlines of Noah's descendants as divine precedent for genetic concentration. Every deformed child wasn't seen as evidence of their failure, but as proof that they were approaching God's intended design for humanity. "We have calculated that 17 generations of perfect breeding will produce children with divine characteristics," Brother Augustus explained, showing Dr. Pland Zimmermann a chart mapping their projected genetic timeline. Some families are already in their 9th generation of concentrated bloodlines. The mathematical precision of their delusion was breathtaking. They had developed formulas for determining optimal breeding pairs, charts tracking the inheritance of specific traits, and even predictions about when their children would begin exhibiting what they called transcendent characteristics. The fact that none of their predictions had manifested didn't shake their faith. It only convinced them they needed to concentrate their bloodlines further. Records from 1843 show the network had established what they called genetic sanctuaries in remote locations across Central Europe. Each sanctuary housed the most severely inbred children from multiple families, creating living laboratories where they could observe the effects of extreme genetic concentration while maintaining the religious framework that justified their experiments. A letter from the Bavarian sanctuary, dated September 7, 1846, reported, "The Brenner child has survived 14 months despite lacking functional kidneys. We interpret this as divine intervention, proving our methods approach sacred perfection." The family requests guidance on the next breeding cycle. How do you stop people who believe their children's suffering serves a higher purpose? Dr. Zimmermann's examination of the children revealed that the network had been systematically documenting genetic abnormalities while interpreting them through their religious lens. Cleft palates became divine markings. Severe intellectual disabilities were seen as spiritual transcendence beyond earthly concerns, and physical deformities were described as approaching angelic forms not bound by human limitations. They had even developed a ranking system based on how many genetic defects a child exhibited, with the most severely damaged children receiving the highest honor as closest to divine perfection. Parents competed to produce the most genetically concentrated offspring, viewing each additional deformity as evidence of their spiritual advancement. The network's correspondence reveals they had been tracking birth outcomes across all participating families since 1778. Of the estimated 437 children born into the program, only 43 had survived past their 5th birthday. The families interpreted this 90% mortality rate not as evidence of their practice's horror, but as proof that they were approaching something so transcendent that earthly bodies couldn't contain it. Children became sacrifices to genetic obsession. Brother Augustus showed Dr. Zimmermann the network's most prized possession, a genealogical chart predicting the bloodline that would eventually produce what they called the perfect child. According to their calculations, this child would be born sometime in the 1850s from a bloodline that had achieved complete genetic concentration, a human being with virtually no genetic diversity whatsoever. The Weiss child represents significant progress toward this goal, Brother Augustus said, his eyes gleaming with fanatic certainty. Her survival suggests we are very close to achieving our divine mission. Dr. Zimmermann realized with growing horror that baby Gretchen wasn't the tragic endpoint of the Weiss family's experimentation. She was considered a success story that would encourage the network to push even further into genetic extremes. The most disturbing discovery was yet to come. Hidden in the monastery's archives were shipping records showing that children from the network weren't just being bred within individual families anymore. They were being systematically moved between genetic sanctuaries to create breeding pairs with even higher levels of inbreeding than anything previously attempted. The shipping manifest, dated December 12, 1847, read like a livestock inventory, but the cargo being transported across frozen German countryside consisted of children whose genetic makeup had been calculated to the decimal point. Dr. Zimmermann's hands trembled as he read the clinical descriptions. Female, age 14, inbreeding coefficient 0.42, suitable for pairing with Hoffman male, coefficient 0.39. The network had evolved beyond family-based inbreeding into a coordinated breeding program designed to create the most genetically concentrated human being possible, and they believed they were only months away from success. The monastery's basement archives contained transportation records spanning 3 decades, documenting the systematic movement of children between genetic sanctuaries across Europe. The sound of horse-drawn carriages crunching through snow echoed through Dr. Prey's. Zimmermann's memory, as Brother Augustus, described the winter convoys, the scent of hay and human waste, mixing in poorly ventilated transport boxes, and the rough wooden crates lined with straw, where barely conscious children were shipped like precious cargo. We calculate that crossing the Weiss bloodline with the Bavarian Brenner line will produce offspring with an inbreeding coefficient of 0.53, Brother Augustus explained, consulting a ledger filled with mathematical equations. This represents the highest level of genetic concentration ever attempted in recorded history. The transportation logs revealed that Anna Weiss's survival of childbirth had triggered immediate action across the network. Within weeks of Gretchen's birth, families from 6 different regions had sent their most genetically concentrated young adults to a special facility in the Austrian Alps where the final phase of their experiment would take place. Dr. Zimmermann learned that the network had been preparing for this moment for 17 years. Since 1830, they had been selectively breeding toward what their calculations suggested would be the ultimate expression of genetic concentration, a child whose parents shared more genetic material than any breeding pair in human history. Medical records from the Alpine facility, discovered sewn into the binding of a prayer book, detailed the horrific reality of their preparations. The young adults selected for this final breeding attempt were barely functional human beings. Most couldn't walk without assistance, few could speak in complete sentences, and all suffered from multiple organ defects that required constant medical intervention. A physician's note from the facility, written in Latin to maintain secrecy, described the breeding candidates. Female subject exhibits severe cognitive impairment, heart defect requiring daily medication, and skeletal deformities that will complicate pregnancy. Male subject shows similar defects plus kidney dysfunction. Estimated survival probability for offspring, less than 10%. Estimated genetic concentration, unprecedented. What kind of society convinces itself that creating the most damaged human possible represents spiritual achievement? The network had even developed contingency plans for their perfect child project. If the primary breeding pair failed to produce viable offspring, they had identified backup combinations that could achieve genetic concentration levels approaching 0.6, a mathematical impossibility that would essentially create a child whose parents were more closely related than identical. Twins. Brother Augustus showed Dr. Zimmermann a theological treatise written specifically to justify this final experiment. When we achieve perfect genetic concentration, it read, we will have created a human vessel capable of containing divine consciousness. This child will bridge the gap between earthly existence and heavenly perfection. The document outlined their expectations for this hypothetical child: superhuman intelligence, immunity to disease, extraordinary physical beauty, and telepathic abilities. The fact that their previous experiments had produced only suffering and death didn't diminish their certainty that genetic concentration would eventually yield these miraculous results. Transportation records from late 1847 showed the network had begun moving their most promising candidates toward the Alpine facility. The journey itself was designed as part of their selection process. Only children strong enough to survive the harsh winter transport would be deemed worthy of participating in the final breeding experiment. Letters between facility administrators revealed the scope of their preparations. We have prepared the ritual chamber according to specifications, wrote one coordinator. The breeding ceremony will take place during the winter solstice to ensure divine blessing upon the conception. Medical staff have been briefed on maintaining the subject's survival long enough to complete the genetic transfer. Some experiments should never be attempted. Dr. Zimmermann realized that while he had been documenting the network's past crimes, they were actively preparing to create something that would represent the absolute pinnacle of human genetic damage. The perfect child they envisioned would suffer from every possible consequence of extreme inbreeding, concentrated into a single organism that might not survive even the birth process. But his investigation had revealed something even more disturbing than their immediate plans. Hidden within the facility's correspondence were references to international expansion. The network had been contacted by similar groups in Russia, Scandinavia, and even the American frontier territories. The genetic experimentation that had begun in isolated German farmhouses was preparing to spread across the globe. The race to stop the Perfect Child project had begun, but Dr. Zimmermann was about to discover that the network's most dangerous believers occupied positions of power that made exposure nearly impossible. Baron Friedrich von Habsburg entered the Alpine facility on January 6, 1848, his polished boots clicking against stone floors, as he inspected what he privately called the future of European nobility. The flickering torchlight cast shadows across his scarred face. The metallic scent of blood and antiseptic hung heavy in the mountain air, and the rough granite walls echoed with sounds that no civilized person should have to hear. Dr. Zimmermann had stumbled upon the most terrifying discovery of his investigation. The genetic experimentation network wasn't operating in secret. It was being funded and protected by some of the most powerful families in Central Europe. The Baron's correspondence, discovered in a hidden compartment of his traveling desk, revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. European nobility had been quietly supporting the breeding experiments for decades, viewing them as a way to preserve aristocratic bloodlines, while experimenting with genetic concentration that might enhance the hereditary traits they believed made them superior to common people. The peasant families serve as perfect test subjects, von Habsburg had written to his cousin in Vienna. Their religious fervor ensures compliance, while their isolation prevents unwanted attention. Once we perfect the methodology, we can apply these techniques to preserve the purity of noble bloodlines across Europe. The facility's guest registry read like a who's who of European aristocracy. Prince Wilhelm of Bavaria had visited 3 times in 1847. Count Alexander von Metternich had personally donated funds for expanding the breeding chambers. Even representatives from the Habsburg court in Vienna had conducted official inspections, documenting the experiments as potential tools for strengthening the imperial bloodline. These weren't isolated madmen conducting basement experiments. They were being studied and supported by the highest levels of European society. The network's theological justifications had provided perfect cover for what was essentially government-sanctioned human experimentation decades before. Such practices would be officially recognized as crimes against humanity. Dr. Zimmermann's attempts to report his findings to local authorities revealed the depth of official complicity. The regional magistrate, Herr Klaus Müller, refused to investigate the Alpine facility, claiming it fell under special ecclesiastical jurisdiction that exempted it from civil oversight. The local police captain, Friedrich Brenner, turned out to be a distant cousin of one of the breeding families and had been receiving regular payments to ensure their activities remained undisturbed. When Dr. Zimmermann approached the medical authorities in Dresden, he was told that the genetic experiments fell under advanced research protocols that had been approved at the highest levels of government. His request to examine the children at the Alpine facility was denied on grounds of protecting sensitive scientific work of national importance. How do you expose evil when the entire system is designed to protect it? Court records from 1848 show that several physicians who had attempted to document the network's activities had been quietly discredited, transferred to remote posts, or simply disappeared. Dr. Johann Henkel, who had tried to publish a paper about genetic damage in isolated communities, was accused of professional misconduct and stripped of his medical license. Dr. Wilhelm Gross, who had attempted to provide medical care to some of the damaged children, was arrested on fabricated charges of sedition. The conspiracy reached international levels. Letters between Baron von Habsburg and contacts in France revealed that similar genetic concentration programs were being established in other countries, all under the protection of aristocratic families who viewed the experiments as essential research for maintaining their bloodline superiority. A particularly damning letter from the French court, dated March 15, 1848, outlined plans for creating genetic preservation centers across Europe. We must accelerate our timeline, given the current political instabilities. These breeding programs represent our best hope for maintaining aristocratic genetic advantages in an increasingly democratic age. The European revolutions of 1848 weren't just about political freedom. They had also triggered panic among nobility, who feared that social upheaval would destroy their ability to maintain exclusive bloodlines. The genetic experiments had become their insurance policy against a future where aristocratic breeding privileges might be eliminated. Authority had become accomplice to atrocity. Dr. Zimmermann realized that exposing the network would require more than medical documentation. He was challenging a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of European power. The children suffering in genetic sanctuaries weren't just victims of religious fanaticism. They were casualties of a systematic effort by aristocracy to perfect their own breeding practices using peasant families as test subjects. But his investigation had revealed one crucial weakness in their conspiracy. The aristocratic supporters were so confident in their protection that they had documented everything, creating a paper trail that could expose the entire network if it ever reached the right authorities. Hidden in the Alpine facility's archives were financial records, breeding contracts, and correspondence that implicated dozens of noble families across multiple countries. The question was whether Dr. X. Zimmermann could get that evidence to someone with both the power and the courage to act on it. Before the network completed their Perfect Child project, and before the authorities who protected them decided that he had learned too much. The screams echoing through the Alpine facility on February 14, 1848, they weren't cries of childbirth. They were the sounds of a medical experiment so extreme that even the attending physicians questioned whether they were witnessing the birth of a child or the creation of a monster. Dr. Zimmermann had arrived too late to prevent the final breeding, but just in time to document humanity's most catastrophic genetic experiment. The Perfect Child project had reached its horrifying conclusion, producing an infant whose genetic concentration would redefine the boundaries of human survival. The breeding chamber deep within the mountain facility reeked of carbolic acid and human suffering. The rough stone walls amplified every labored breath, and the iron restraints bore rust stains that spoke to decades of use. Anna Maria Brenner, the 17-year-old girl selected as the mother, lay unconscious on a blood-soaked table, while physicians worked frantically to deliver what their calculations had predicted would be the most genetically concentrated human ever born. Her partner in this final experiment had been her own uncle, Wilhelm Brenner, a man whose family tree showed such extreme inbreeding that he shared 67% of his genetic material with Anna Maria. Their union represented the mathematical pinnacle of the network's 70-year breeding program, a level of genetic concentration that no human being had ever survived. Medical notes from Dr. Heinrich Volker, the facility's chief physician, described the birth in clinical terms that couldn't mask his horror. Infant delivered at 2:47 a.m. Weight, 2 pounds, 8 ounces. Severe cranial deformities present. Multiple organ systems show obvious dysfunction. Breathing requires constant manual assistance. This represents the most extreme case of genetic concentration in medical literature. The child, whom they named Johann in honor of the network's founding patriarch, exhibited every possible consequence of extreme inbreeding compressed into a single organism. His skull was so malformed that brain tissue was visible through gaps in the bone. His internal organs were positioned incorrectly and functioned so poorly that he required continuous medical intervention just to maintain life. His limbs were twisted into positions that defied normal human anatomy. Yet the network's leadership proclaimed his birth a triumph. Baron von Habsburg, who had arrived for the delivery, declared, "We have achieved what God intended, the perfect concentration of divine bloodline. This child represents the future of human evolution. The mathematical reality was even more disturbing than the physical evidence. Genetic calculations showed that Johann's parents shared approximately 73% of their DNA, a level of similarity that exceeded even identical twins. He was essentially the product of one person reproducing with themselves, creating a human being with virtually no genetic diversity whatsoever. What do you call it when science becomes indistinguishable from torture? Dr. Zimmermann's examination revealed that Johann's survival past the first few hours was itself medically impossible. His heart defects should have killed him within minutes. His kidney dysfunction should have caused death within hours, and his neurological abnormalities should have prevented basic life functions. Yet he clung to life with a tenacity that the network interpreted as proof of divine intervention. God sustains him because he represents perfection, Brother Augustus proclaimed, watching as Johann struggled to breathe despite having underdeveloped lungs. His suffering purifies him for the transcendent existence he was born to achieve. The facility's records showed that the network had been preparing for Johann's birth for 18 months, assembling medical equipment and specialists to keep alive what they knew would be a severely compromised infant. They had planned every aspect of his care, from feeding tubes to breathing apparatus, viewing his expected disabilities not as tragic consequences, but as necessary characteristics of genetic perfection. Letters between facility administrators revealed their next phase. They intended to use Johann as breeding stock once he reached adolescence, planning to pair him with other extremely inbred children to push genetic concentration even further. They had calculated that the next generation could achieve inbreeding coefficients to approaching 0.8, a mathematical impossibility that would create organisms more closely related to themselves than any biological entity in recorded history. But Dr. Zimmermann had seen enough. While the network celebrated their achievement, he was documenting evidence that would expose their crimes to authorities beyond their influence. Hidden in his medical bag was a complete record of the facility's activities, including detailed genetic charts, financial records, and correspondence that implicated noble families across Europe. Some boundaries should never be crossed. As Johann struggled through his first week of life, requiring constant medical intervention to survive each day, Dr. Zimmermann prepared to reveal the truth about Europe's most protected secret. But his investigation had uncovered one final horror that would determine whether justice was possible or whether the network's influence extended too far into European power structures to ever be challenged. The perfect child had been born, but the most dangerous battle was still ahead. The envelope that arrived at Dr. Zimmermann's clinic on March 21, 1848, bore the official seal of the Prussian Medical Council, but the message inside shattered every assumption he had made about justice and accountability. The sound of his own heartbeat filled his ears as he read the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The scent of official wax and parchment mixing with his growing nausea, while the polished wooden floors of his office seemed to shift beneath his feet. The Prussian government wasn't going to investigate the genetic experimentation network. They were going to expand it, using Dr. Zimmermann's own documentation as a blueprint for state-sponsored breeding programs. The letter, signed by medical director Wilhelm von Humboldt himself, praised Dr. Stade, Zimmermann's thorough documentation of advanced genetic research, and invited him to join a new government initiative aimed at improving the hereditary quality of German populations through scientific breeding. Protocols. The authorities hadn't viewed his evidence as proof of crimes against humanity. They saw it as a successful proof of concept for genetics programs that could strengthen the German state. Your documentation of concentrated bloodlines, achieving unprecedented genetic focus, represents exactly the scientific advancement our nation requires, the letter continued. We are prepared to offer you the position of Chief Genetic Research Coordinator, with unlimited funding and official protection for expanding these methodologies across German territories. Baby Johann, who had somehow survived his first month, despite genetic defects that should have been fatal, wasn't seen as a tragic victim by government authorities. He was viewed as evidence that extreme genetic manipulation could produce results beyond normal human limitations. The fact that he required constant medical intervention to stay alive was interpreted as proof that they were approaching something transcendent. Dr. Zimmermann's investigation had led him to a horrifying realization. The network hadn't been operating in secret defiance of government authority. They had been conducting research that European governments were planning to implement on a massive scale. The breeding experiments in isolated religious communities had served as test sites for genetic manipulation techniques that would eventually be applied to entire populations. Documents included with the government letter revealed the scope of their plans. Phase 1 involved establishing genetic research facilities in major German cities. Phase 2 called for mandatory genetic testing and breeding recommendations for all German citizens. Phase 3 envisioned international cooperation with other European powers to create continent-wide genetic improvement programs. The monastery where Dr. Zimmermann had first encountered the network's activities was scheduled to become the headquarters for the new government program. Brother Augustus had been appointed as Director of Religious Genetic Research, tasked with using theological arguments to convince populations to participate in state-mandated breeding programs. How do you fight evil when it becomes government policy? The letter's final paragraph contained the most chilling revelation of all. Your documentation has convinced us that the subject known as Johann represents a breakthrough in human genetic potential. We require your immediate assistance in developing protocols for producing similar subjects on a larger scale. The future of German genetic superiority depends on replicating and expanding upon this success. Dr. Zimmermann realized that his investigation hadn't exposed a criminal conspiracy. It had provided evidence that convinced European governments to institutionalize genetic experimentation. Every piece of documentation he had gathered, every medical record he had compiled, every proof of suffering he had witnessed, was now being used to justify expanding the horror rather than stopping it. The network's aristocratic supporters hadn't been protecting illegal experiments. They had been funding research that they always intended to legitimize and expand. Baron von Habsburg's financial records showed payments from multiple European treasuries, indicating that the genetic concentration programs had been government projects from the beginning, disguised as private religious initiatives to test public reaction. Records from baby Johann's medical care revealed that government physicians had been studying his condition not to treat his suffering, but to understand how to replicate his extreme genetic concentration in future breeding programs. They viewed his survival as proof that human beings could withstand far more genetic manipulation than previously thought possible. Truth had become betrayal. On April 1st, 1848, Dr. Zimmermann made a decision that would haunt him forever. Rather than join the government program and become complicit in expanding the genetic experiments, he destroyed his research, burned his documentation, and fled Germany under an assumed identity. But he couldn't destroy what he had helped create. Baby Johann continued to survive against all medical possibility, serving as living proof that extreme genetic manipulation could produce results that European governments found irresistible. The boy who represented humanity's most concentrated genetic experiment would live just long enough to inspire decades of government-sponsored breeding programs across Europe, his existence serving as justification for policies that would eventually culminate in the systematic genetic experimentation of the 20th century. Dr. Zimmermann spent his remaining years in exile, knowing that his investigation had inadvertently provided the scientific foundation for horrors that would dwarf even the network's crimes. Johann's survival had proven that human genetics could be manipulated beyond any natural boundary, and European governments were prepared to test just how far those boundaries could be pushed. Some say that in the remote valleys of Bavaria, families still practice the old ways of bloodline concentration, believing they carry on Johann's genetic legacy. Others claim that government breeding programs continued in secret long after they were officially discontinued, hidden in institutions where the most genetically damaged children are kept away from public view. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.